As creatives, inspiration often comes from the world around us. We get inspired by the things we see and experience. But what if your context isn't a bustling city or a picturesque town, but the Antarctic? What if your daily environment is one of the most remote and fragile ecosystems on Earth, and you are surrounded by undeniable evidence of damaging changes? Today's guest works in the Antarctic as a marine biologist, and the jewellery she creates embodies the intersection of science, art, and perhaps responsibility. As a team member of the British Antarctic Survey and a jewellery maker inspired by Southern Ocean seashells, she brings a unique perspective to what sustainability means in practice, and her work invites us to reflect on our relationship with nature and how creativity can inspire stewardship. For the BAJ Podcast today, I'm therefore excited to welcome Dr. Katrin Linse. Welcome, Katrin.
Thank you, Sophie. Yes, thanks for the nice introduction. And yes, I'm a German scientist who came to the UK 25 years ago, and I had the possibility to start at the British Antarctic Survey, which had been a dream of myself to go to the Antarctic and work there since I was 12 years old. And so I was fascinated by marine sea life, by just growing up near the seashores, being on holiday there, picking up shells, little crabs that you found dead on the flotsam, so the end where the water and the sand meet. And some of them you pick up, you take home, and you look at them years later. And so that was my inspiration getting into marine science and seeing what are they called? Do they have names? Are they new? Have we seen them before? And with the possibility then to work at BAS, I had the possibility to work in a team that looks at the richness of sea creatures that live at the bottom of the sea. So most work I do is on animals that are little bivalves, gastropods, little crabs, little starfish, little sea cucumbers. And I worked from the intertidal, diving myself in the shallow waters, to using really technological equipment, state-of-the-art remote operating vehicles, where you send a robot to the depths of the seafloor down to several thousand meters to see what animals live there, and then collect them, because often nobody has seen them before. They don't have a name, and so they come up and you can describe them.
You mentioned you're a marine biologist. You have a PhD in zoology. Could you tell us a little bit more about sort of the subjects of marine biology and zoology? And perhaps you mentioned you were drawn to this subject through being by the sea and collecting items. What was it that inspired you to really build a career out of it?
Because even in the mid-80s, we have seen, or we had some young biologists on a campsite I was staying with my parents. And we noticed that in the Norwegian area, we had some weird jellyfish coming in. And they explained to us that these jellyfish are not normally there, that they only come in when the warmer waters come in. And so it's quite unusual. And then a few years later, we realized we had those jellyfish more often. So in the first time you heard that maybe our oceans are changing, that we get warmer waters into the north of the European waters, and with them, the animals more used to warmer waters would come up and can be found. And then that was inspiring, interesting. And then I thought the Antarctic is a place where biological research not just started in the 80s, we have it for over 150 years, but several countries started again to look into the species richness. We started to know we have a good idea what lives on land, but we don't have a good idea what lives in the sea. And so this is where a position was free to look into the Antarctic seashells, so bivalves and gastropods and clams, and seeing how long have they lived there. Did they develop their own clades because the Antarctic for about 30 million years has been separated from the other continents by a very, very strong current, the polar front. And there was the idea 25, 30 years ago that animals were not able to cross it. And if you're not able to cross it in your evolution, you can only reproduce in your special areas and don't interact with anybody else. So you should have a very distinct clade and family formed. And so the idea was, do we have species that are managed to cross those barriers, or do you have endemic species in the Antarctic and then others outside the Antarctic? And this is where I came in, and we used mollusk as an example. And I already had studied mollusks of South America in my PhD, so it was continuing with some part of the work. So I was already had for work, a collection, a reference collection of seashells with me. So I could, when I found Antarctic ones, compare them through the South American ones, saying, are they similar? What are the differences? And in recent years, using molecular techniques to look into the DNA, how similar they are.
Wow. And so is it true that there isn't a crossover between the species, so that the current means you can't reach, or is that not true?
Well, we do know that because we have in the Antarctic about 17,000 invertebrates, animals living on the seafloor. And of course, if you have this number of species, everybody is unique. So some can do it and others can't. So you can't equalize it across all. You have to look into smaller areas. And we have some animals some holothurians, sea cucumbers, where the sperm and the eggs are released into the water column and find each other, and they can drift with the currents for thousands of meters. So they are easier to get over. But if you're a little bivalve species that broods the young inside the mother's shell, and then when they are ready to come out, they just drop out of the mother. And you can imagine that those ones will live close to the maternal parents. And for them, it's much harder to cross a barrier. But if they live on a seaweed and the seaweed is ripped off and is then floating away, it could. So this is where we have a huge diversity of species in the Antarctic. And this was part of what I study.
You mentioned you work for the British Antarctic Survey. Could you tell us a bit more about BAS and what it is like to work in the Antarctic on a day-to-day basis? I imagine it being quite cold and very different to life in a city or in a town.
So the British Antarctic Survey is a national environmental research council institute in the UK, and it enables us to study the polar environments, the polar regions, seeing how they are changing and how the changes in the Antarctic affect the global world. And we realize now that, especially in the oceanography, that a lot of the current flow is very important to the global climate, and that one of the drivers is when really cold water is being formed, water that is more than -2 degrees. And that starts that conveyor belt of ocean currents that makes the global climate. And these currents are changing. So that is one part of what is doing it. It's looking at a lot of the environmental research on what do we have there, how can we protect it, and how can we change it. And the Antarctic is one of the few places in the Earth that politically is an apolitical area. We just should do research there, and it's protected by the Antarctic Treaty. And BAS is one of the institutions that are represented in the Antarctic Treaty meetings to represent the UK there. In BAS, we have about 400 staff from very different countries and very different backgrounds. And not all of us are researchers because, of course, in the Antarctic, we need every skill. We have the British Antarctic Survey has several bases, some of them that go the whole year round. And so you need skills from plumbing skills to cooking skills to engineering skills, and then coming to the researchers from looking atmospheric meteorological research to geology, physics to biology. And this is for me as a marine biologist. Most of the time when I go to the Antarctic, I will be on the research vessel because the research vessels enable us to go to different places in the ocean and study the ocean from the ocean surface to the deep sea floor. And the deep sea floor is the habitat I'm most interested in. And then when we are on board, you asked if it's cold. Well, if it's cold outside, but if you have the right clothing, you dress up and we are supplied with the right clothing to stay warm in the harsh environments. And then when we are on a vessel, we are glad we can go inside. And of course, there are heating systems inside.
Yeah, lucky. You have also been making jewelry aside from the work that you do as a marine biologist. Could you tell us what inspired you to go into this direction and perhaps where you gained your skills?
I started making jewelry in the early 2000s in a place called White House Arts in Cambridge, which was a privately run little studio for different arts from pottery to jewelry making. And I was walking along the river in Cambridge to look at the Cambridge boat race, where a colleague of mine was one of the marshals. And we passed by this house, and his wife said hello. And she was saying, "Oh, I'm doing this jewellery course, and given your husband is going to the Antarctic as well, and you sit at home alone in your weekends, why not come for one evening the week and join one of the jewellery classes? I'm sure you would like it." And so this is when I started my first silversmithing for beginners class with a jeweler called Francesca Bigger. And she taught me the first how to solder, how to use a fret saw, quite from the early beginnings. And we had projects to do, and I liked it. And one of the projects, she said, was let's learn about casting. So we also did our own designs out of wax and tried to cast them in clay. But she also said if you want to have a really fine detailed casts, you often use casting companies. So we had to bring in some items. And I thought, oh, I'm quite interested to cast a couple of shells that I had from my PhD work, from an Antarctic bivalve and an Antarctic gastropod. And they came out quite nicely. And that was the first inspiration to do these casts. And then I gave them to a friend for her 40th birthday, and she got really good comments about them. And then I thought maybe I'd do that again. And then we went to a very special expedition where we discovered the first black smoking vents in the Antarctic. And sometimes those animals that you can find there, you don't have one or two when you collect them. You have a few hundred. And we had a lot of students working on them. And we worked quite late sometimes in the nights. And those animals are less than a centimeters. And one I discovered the next morning was hiding in a crack on the table. So it had dried out. So we couldn't use it for the genetic work anymore because all its tissue had dried. But I thought, you can come with me. I cast you. And afterwards, and I get a mold made so it can be recast. And afterwards, this little specimen went into a raisin shell, or I made a raisin mold, and now I use it for outreach. So when we have outreach activities in BAS, going to schools or going to science fairs, or I think some of the colleagues go to the Blue Dot Festival, they now take my examples from resin casts of animals and take them there so the public can see them. So this is where the animals I used for my jewelry are still working for science or working for the science outreach. But then the little silver casts I've done do the outreach as well when they are given away.
I want to ask you as well, these sort of two worlds, art design and science, do they come together? Are there sort of interesting overlaps and parallels? Do you find inspiration in either to use in the other? So perhaps not just finding bits to cast in jewelry and then give them away, but maybe does something come back from the jewelry practice into the science practice as well?
Having learned the soldering techniques, it's like when you then have science equipment that has a problem, those techniques can be used to fix something when you have fine soldering skills, or when you know how to use really fine tools to open something up to get a specimen out. So yes, there's an overlap, but there's clearly an overlap between arts and sciences because both areas are really wide. So you can, how long is a piece of string? But for me, in natural sciences, I can see that there are a lot of artists inspired by science and start that and bring it further away. And you see, it's the science, this nature is so fantastic. And this is where I started with the Antarctic shells. But now I thought, like, we have shells on our seafloors. We have a little cowrie in the British Isles, which is just lovely. It's again a small animal of a centimeter, 8 millimeters, which really nicely goes as a pendant or as earrings. And it's such a fantastic form. So that's one of my next projects to cast. So it's an inspiration. And you have scientists who draw them as a natural drawing, or they make them abstract, or it's so wide. And you can see it in jewellery flowing and the creation of nature-related objects. It's really a linkage between the two. And there's a lot of science into art and art into science campaigns. You reach a different group of people that are interested in the one or the other and suddenly realize, oh, I've never thought of going into an art exhibition because I'm fully on natural sciences, but this is interesting. Maybe I go over there more often and have a look. Or the artist coming in saying, oh, this can be interesting. Can I use something of that knowledge or those skills or those ideas in my projects?
Yeah, for sure. I wonder, do you also, now that you're sort of thinking of casting and making things in metal and translating those, do you also think that you look slightly differently at what you see in terms of more focused on shape and texture and yeah, what they feel like that maybe are not so relevant to, well, they might be relevant to science. That's an assumption.
Yes, I definitely, when I now see anybody was walking along with jewelry, whatever type of jewelry, I'm looking more, how is that made? What is that made of? And you can say I'm traditional, I'm in the metal jewelries, I like the silvers or the golds, but you can mix metals and you have so many different materials you can use. And the current teacher I have, so I'm still going to an evening class once a week. And now it's not the White House Arts anymore. We are in a place called Cambridge Makers in Linton. And so Rebecca Elliott is teaching us now, and she's inspiring us to also use different techniques, using different materials, using we are discussing a full breadth of different jewelry techniques, what you can do. And she's showing us her examples, what she's currently working on, and discussing other jewelers, discussing the Goldsmiths Fair and looking through the booklets there, what is around. And yeah, it is inspiring. And I've been to one of the fairs where I'd seen one jeweler using the leftover grains of coffee to then make that into jewelry. And that's something where I hadn't thought about before. And then I think, could I do that in my type of jewelry? Because I'm aware that taking an animal from nature makes an impact. And yes, for the science that I do, where I often have the possibility to get specimens from an area like the deep sea in several thousand meters, where you can't just go in. We take those specimens to learn about how many species live on the earth, what is out there, what is new there. So we need to collect them because we can't do that only by imaging. We need to then find out on their DNA how they are related. But those specimens then will go into a museum. So, and some of them I would never cast because they are so special and we don't have big numbers. But now with 3D technologies, and we are using those 3D technologies in science. So when somebody else wants to research that animal, we don't need to send that precious type out where we maybe only have 10 specimens collected worldwide. We then can send a 3D print, or we have the 3D models and you can study them. And this is where we can now print them. So we could do our jewellery based on an image and then print them in the materials we like. And that's something where I'm thinking, wow, that's bringing new possibilities. Because some museums even nowadays go and publish their 3D scans, and then anybody could go in and say, okay, this is something I want to bring out. And by wearing the jewellery, you create an interest in people. And I had a couple of amphipods that I cast for the 50th birthday of my PhD supervisor with a colleague together, and they gave her as a pendant, and that she then was wearing it on a train. And the man opposite suddenly started talking to her and apologized for addressing her and said, like, you have a very interesting pendant. My daughter is working or studied biology, and she told me about little animals. And where did you get that from? And then I received an email saying, could you make one for my daughter? But it starts discussions between people.
You've mentioned a few of the sea creatures that you have been working on, and perhaps could you pick out one more and sort of tell us what changed for you to see it also when you've duplicated them? What does the duplication process sort of give you as a storytelling opportunity or from an artistic perspective? And you've mentioned already it allows people to think about it. What do what's the biggest hope you have for what happens when your pieces are seen by viewers?
I hope that they like them. And this is because the ethics is a big thing. And this is where I don't just think this animal looks fantastic, I'll dry it and use it. I'm going through our collections and have a look. Oh, sometimes we store them in alcohol, and sometimes that evaporates because if you have thousands of vials, the one might dry out, and that's the ones I would use because I'm more thinking about the ethics. All the samples we collect, we have to have the research permits. You can't just go there and pick them. And this is getting more and more important. So I'm thinking, I I love replicating them, but how can I do it without using that and without creating a potential interest there in going and trying to search, or just using specimens you can find on our beaches? Because we have these fantastic animals in the British, around the British Isles, and we have them coming to shore and dying there, and you could pick them, and you don't have that as a problem as you have in a different country. But bringing the 3D, the imaging of them, is for me a great idea, and replicate them. You can give them to people. We had a tiny little sea cucumber from the Arctic, and it's called a sea peck. And people ask, what are they doing and where do they live? And are they threatened by something? And what is the threats that they are under? Can we stop something there? And through wearing natural jewelry, you can start discussions about how the world is changing.
From your perspective as an expert, what are the most pressing threats to the ocean and its biodiversity?
Global, in the ocean, we have the threats through the fisheries. In the deep sea, it's the threats through the businesses where we as a human race, we want to get more technologies, more modern technologies that using rare earths. There's a lot of discussion about the deep sea mining. And to get those rare metals and rare earths, you would go to some areas where you have manganese nodules, which is a unique habitat for animals. So that is a threat. Because if you disturb their habitat and they have been living there or there for a long, long time, and those manganese nodules take millions to grow often, millions of years. So if you remove them, you remove a habitat that will not come back in a short time. So the species that are adapted to it would disappear. If we do our fisheries, if we remove some fish animals, if we remove any animal in the ecosystem, it has a feedback to everything around it. And we often don't yet know and understand how species are connected. We have the climate change that is impacting. So we do know that water temperatures are changing, or sometimes we get more acidic waters, and that has an influence on the species that are affected by it. So it might be that they grow smaller, but this means that the animals that are there to feed on them, that are used to feed on larger animals, might not get the food they need. So we are changing the whole food chain, the whole ecosystem from the shallow waters to the deep. And we don't know yet what the effects will be. But from effects that we have seen in the past, they can't be good. We do know with warmer waters we get invasive species that don't have a natural predator. So they can explode in their population size and taking the niches from others. So, yeah, there are pressing threats that we humans make to the world and to the oceans. But there's also awareness of it. And it's not just that we go in and plow through it. There's a lot of engagement in how can we lessen the impacts we have, or other ways that we can bring the habitats back to how they have been. And it seems to be easier in shallower waters. There are big initiatives to bring in new seagrass beds, which had disappeared. But in the deep sea, we don't know yet how we are affecting it and how we could restore it. But there's a lot of discussions going on in the restoration. And so I think nowadays we know more about the impacts we have done than maybe 30, 40 years ago.
When you work in a context where you are confronted with this and you're researching into the impacts as well, how do you stay positive about where we are today and where we're going?
Life can adapt, and life will adapt, and there will be life on Earth. And it's like the Earth has been around for millions of years, and species have been around for millions of years, and they have so much resilience, and we don't know what the resilience is. And it's when we started talking about ocean acidification, where we said those little shells that live in the top meters of the ocean are really affected. They are thinning. They might disappear in the next years or decades. Some of them, they were able to cope with it. They are not, the life is not as easy as it has been. And there have been changes that have fed through the whole, but there's a resilience in life. And this is where to find that out and see how it's changing and how we can help to have it changing or how to minimize. That is what I find as a positive. We say, okay, we make an impact, but how can I minimize my impact? We learned about plastics in the ocean, and that was a big campaign. And yes, it's still going on, but also we have reduced things there. So I think bringing the knowledge out is the importance, and this is why I'm positive and getting people talking about it. It's after the first Blue Planet series came out, I had the chance to speak to Sir David Attenborough, and I was saying a lot of the movies or documentaries you do in Envelop, they all go on the charismatic megafauna, on the large animals, on the whales, on the seal, on some of the fish. You don't really look into the small world. You don't look at these fantastic types of sponges that are around or little crab. And he just said to me, wait for the next one. And it was interesting. And yes, the next series then had this Japanese glass sponge where you have a pair of crustaceans, of shrimps living inside. And this just opens to the public. There is more than fish and whales in the ocean, or seashells, because shells we have seen because they wash to the shore and they have been used as money for hundreds, thousands of years. But there's so much more, and we are now becoming more aware. And I think this is getting the awareness out is important, because then we can say, and you can bring the awareness out through the sciences, through the arts, and this is where the combination is.
We've been talking about how jewelry can perform an advocacy function for ocean conservation. In general, how important do you think it is that creative practices like jewelry making are contributing to raising awareness or inspiring action on climate change and ocean health?
Creativity is important because everybody of us will have a creative side in them. I think you can relax through it when you do build something, make something, or read about something, look at something. And this is where the awareness comes in. And then when you're interested in it or have positive or negative feelings about it, you're more prone to change something. And I have seen some of the strongest advocates for the conservation of the deep sea in interviews or in documentaries, and they were wearing long necklaces that had marine animals on it. And I just, yes, you could say I'm biased because I looked at that, but they were seen with it by millions of people. And they think, oh, that's interesting. So it's a starting on the discussion point. And so I think, yeah, it's very important to make the event. And you will see that there are a lot of science campaigns and big programs that have art as a part to do the outreach for the science. There are more and more initiatives where different artists are taken onto expeditions to then bring some art and creativity back, from poems to drawings to theater plays to very nationalistic drawn pictures that where you can think it's almost like a science descriptive drawing to very abstract drawing. So artists and researchers seem to have both a very creative thinking brain.
What you are doing with these little creatures, that particularly the ones we don't have access to from the Antarctic, is when you have them in your hand, things become real.
Yes.
Making kin with something that you don't necessarily can see in your day-to-day life. And I think Donna Haraway writes about artists and how they do this, because the last thing we want is everyone to travel to the Antarctic to go and see things.
No, this is because you're right there, because we don't want everybody to travel there. I don't have anything against the tourist trade in the Antarctic, because it's the same. I see it like with zoos. If you don't see it or experience it, you don't have the advocates to talk about it. Why should I care about a lion in Africa when I've never seen it? I would not take a lion from Africa nowadays to bring it to a zoo in the UK. But over the years, we don't need, we brought them once, and now we have their offspring, which can't go back. So they are the advocates for the environment. And it's the same with the, as you said, with these Antarctic or deep sea species. I started with some of them that I cast, but I also, as I said, I have a lot of animals that I have cast in resin, almost like paperweights, but they are much bigger. And they are the outreach animals where you can see it. And where, as you said, you make kin. And I think this is really important
Mhm.
that people can see it. And in German, we have a word for understanding that is called begreifen. So you touch and feel it. So when you have it had it in your hands, you have a completely different understanding than when you just read about it. And this is what inspired me to set animals for outreach into resin.
Mhm.
And this is, yes, this is very similar to the little casts.
So to tackle the world's greatest challenges, we are aware we need multidisciplinary initiatives to look for solutions. Do you envision that collaborations between scientists and artists, but perhaps also other disciplinary experts, can be a way not just to communicate complex environmental issues, but also can there be other ways that you feel artists can make meaningful contributions to tackling challenges?
Yes, artists see them in a different way. I think whatever we do or in a science, I have a hypothesis at the start of, I have a problem, I form a hypothesis, and I think most of the time I'm biased in the way when I form the hypothesis on which way I want to have it answered. And I go along and design an experiment, for example, on how to answer it. And it might be that the result is that my hypothesis will not end in the way that I wanted it, but it's the end, it's what the science said. But I go in there with my subjective scientific brain, with my views. But I think artists often see the world in different ways and do the focus somewhere different. And by looking at our problems that we have in research, they might find solutions or see other ways to come to a solution by looking at it from their way. And this is where I think this multidisciplinary is very important.
Mhm.
And it's very important for me within sciences that we look at the question multidisciplinary, but also then across. And it has become more and more not popular, but quite in science that you don't do your research only, but you also bring sociology in or other things. And this is where the arts could come in or should come in and see how they see it.
Lateral thinking. Question, is the question the right question? Could you even change the question? And that's hopefully something that can be contributed.
Yeah, and make your own question and do it yourself. This is my sister, interestingly, is an artist.
I'm not surprised.
So, and a lot of her art is also inspired by nature, but she's also teaching at a college of further education to students that are often in educational jobs, working in nurseries or working in zoos. And so in her art projects, she said she sees more and more that when you say, do and create this, that they would go onto their phones or social media and look at TikTok for or Instagram, what is somebody else doing, instead of thinking about how they would start it. It's just, we're at Christmas time. If you say, do a Christmas star that primary school child can do with materials you have at home. When we grew up, I'm in my 50s, we had to look at either books or and then form our own ideas. Nowadays, we can just pick it somewhere. So our creativity is getting smaller or less used. And I think this is where we need to go back to where we were, thinking how we can reuse materials, how we can reuse clothes. Do we really need to go out and buy everything? Do we need a new phone every year? Do we? Yeah, and I think this is where from all arts and crafts it's coming in. And even if we are now saying the clothing industry, where on their shows you have some designers that go very into the not only using old materials it's like old fabrics, but also using different materials. And if you only look at social media to see what somebody else has done, you never come forward. And so much has changed there and progressed and helped the environment by we're now able to recycle some plastics or some plastic fabrics and reuse them. We couldn't do that 30 years ago. And on the last expedition I was on, I thought, like, how can I engage the younger generation of scientists in there that in our spare time we don't just sit and play computer games or feed our social media channels. And what I did, and I've done it on two expeditions. I said, okay, I'll take knitting needles, crochet needles, a couple of books that I found on little amiguri sea animals, and have the wool there in a common room for everybody to use and do something. And then, yes, you start up, and some just learned how to do it because it's harder to bring your jewellery kits in and open that up to everybody. But we started up making the animals that were there and trying to do the colors. But even just changing a color of something is a creative thinking process. And yes, we then had one of the students say, oh yeah, for a farewell present for our cruise leaders, we wanted to give them some gifts, crochet gifts, and one works on Antarctic krill. And we didn't have a pattern on krill, we had a crab pattern for a shrimp, but you can modify it. You just make it a bit longer. And this is a creative thinking process that came in, and I really like that.
Is there something you are currently working on that you are happy to share with our listeners, scientific or artistic, that we could look forward to seeing, discovering, reading from you in the near future?
Well, science-wise, we have in a larger group a current paper accepted, or we just got the proofs 2 days ago, which is about gas hydrates on the seafloor. And gas hydrates is like the gas, the methane gas that we are using, for example, for heating our houses, is when it's under certain conditions with the right temperature, which is cold, and the pressure, right pressure, which is high, it forms ice. It gets solid like ice. And this is what is a gas hydrate. And we found them in the Arctic, up in big mounds, 2-3 meters high, 6 meters wide, where they came to the surface and they start degassing and bubbling. They make a food source for specialized animals, but also they are changing the chemistry in the water. And it was the first time that gas hydrates were found in the Arctic deep sea at the surface. We all know about our gas wells in the North Sea that we drill, or the oil and gas drills for thousands of meters to go down thousands of meters in the seafloor to reach it. But here it's on the surface and it has a very specialized fauna around it. And that's a paper that is coming out soon.
Wow, amazing.
So, and then because it's in north of Svalbard in the Arctic area, we named it after one of the Nordic gods as the Freya Mounds. So yes, it's something that's coming out in research.
Our world faces complex and urgent challenges: climate change, biodiversity loss, and the fragility of ecosystems we may never see in person. As Donna Haraway urges, we must learn to stay with the trouble, resisting band-aid solutions and instead cultivating what she calls responsibility, or the ability to respond with care and creativity. Art offers a way to become with these distant problems, forging connections that inspire action without requiring physical presence. Jewellery in particular holds a unique position. It's intimate, wearable, and deeply symbolic. So when science and art intersect, as in Katrin's work, jewellery becomes more than adornment. It becomes kin making. It becomes a conversation starter, a catalyst for awareness, and a reminder, perhaps, of our responsibility to the planet. Thank you, Katrin, for your time sketching out your important role and inspiring creative practice, and for joining me for the BAJ podcast today. We are very grateful for your efforts and your time.
Thank you, Sophie. It was really nice.
Over the holiday period, I'll be taking a little break from podcasting, but in the new year, I will be joined by another guest, so watch this space to find out who it is. For now, this was Sofie Boons for the BAJ podcast episode titled Fragments of the Antarctic with Dr. Katrin Linse. Thank you for listening and have a festive time.